So good day, good night, good morning to all of you. And thank you so much for sort of assembling here in this virtual space for this presentation and I hope discussion. So for those of you who don't know me, my name's Pauline Tiffen and I'm speaking to you now from my home in the southwest of England. I'm safe with my family. I would only hope that for all of you. As Colleen said, for more than 30 years, I've worked for fair trade, for socially committed enterprises all around the world. And I was really honoured to be invited by the Scottish Fair Trade Forum to give this lecture. And it was exceedingly thought-provoking time for this. My basic case here is that the fair trade fundamental principles of organising and being businesses have a more vital place than ever in our economies post-COVID. But if I had been not in a COVID pandemic here today, I think my talk would have been really, really different, because fair trade before COVID-19 was a very patchy and a slightly sad story. Fair traders were finding themselves in terribly hard times. And yes, we're witnessing a lot of closures of all kinds of organizations and companies now, but the recent years have seen horrible and painful struggles of many fair trade businesses to survive. And some have not survived, they've failed and closed down. But broadly, this is because they could not sustain their voice, their message, their market presence in competition with mainstream propositions of ethical and even fair trade. And I would say now the new buzzword sustainability claims, which also claim fairness and also claim care for people. And most of the businesses that I know and have watched struggle and even worked with have effectively lacked most of the tools of conventional businesses, the communications, the budgets to convince customers of their meaning and their intentions and their worth, the ways to bring in new investment, even to grow. Even successful businesses have found it incredibly hard to grow. And then I think even more painfully or more disappointingly, I think fair traders have failed to think about reorganizing themselves and to collaborate and ally with others. So we're very atomized. In other sectors, you know, you have, and in capitalism, you have mergers and acquisitions. We didn't find an alternative for that to keep our weight and to keep our voice. But as I prepared for this lecture, both Colleen, who wrote to me and said, I think we have to mention COVID-19. Oh, wait, yes, I think we do. And many of the heroes, my heroes of our movement, I reached out and got a lot of responses, and it's been really interesting, but also a little painful. And I want to illustrate this story with one quote. It's anonymous for now because I forgot to ask if I could use it. So I haven't identified who said it. But I got this the other day from somebody in our movement. My business and life is proceeding with complexity under COVID times. Our factory, purchasing and supply chains are all super active as food is in demand, but it's very, very hard to make the finances stack up. And fair trade, one word, or fair trade, two words, doesn't draw buyers or brand owners or interest anymore. We're fighting to produce while keeping staff safe and socially distanced. Fair trade is still seen as important, but most people are circumventing it, green haloing themselves with social programs or charitable gloss. Instagram and other social media have made it far easier to present a glossy link to producers or self-publish what they're doing rather than really doing hard work. I have felt this as an existential threat to fair trade for some time, and that many people in fair trade are not taking these risks seriously enough. With fair trade leaders like Sophie Tranchell having left Divine, chocolate, Robin Murray gone, a great thinker, and many of the first generation of fair traders fading away, I have felt a profound loss of moral spine and urgency around these issues. So I have to say, I share a lot of this unease. And ideas are really important. And when we launched the Journal of Fair Trade, it was with the intent of rethinking, rebooting, reclaiming this great vision and determining what the ideals really were. And I just wanted to reference our website, where we put up a section on inspiring people like Robin Murray and the things that they wrote about and the things that they guided us with, and all other people who've helped our movement to think and act in the past, such as Michael Barrett Brown and Bert Beckman, who passed away recently, Mark Hayes, who founded Shared Interest. All of this challenge is one of the reasons I launched the Journal of Fair Trade, to embrace all the things we would like to see in the world and that we thought we were doing. Earnest, authentic, practical efforts to create fairness in trade. So I should just say that, so I came into the lecture feeling a little, when I was first invited by the Scottish Fair Trade Forum, feeling a little down. But ironically, as the pandemic is making hell for all of us, wherever we are, wherever you all are, I've ended up feeling a bit more combative. There's nothing like a problem to get my juices flowing. So all this bad stuff said, fair traders and social enterprises have always, and they continue to punch way above their weight in their worlds, across worlds, and they're full of guts and determination in their missions. And I very much like the word that Erinch from WFTO used just the other day to describe all of you, which was stubborn. So yes, stubborn. So I'm applauding here today, all stubborn and brilliant people everywhere doing the right thing in the right way. And I firmly believe that this terrible experience that we're all going through, so much fear, so much concern and uncertainty, will show that fair traders, people who inject that into the DNA of their businesses and their activities and their relationships, are the real market leaders, and they deserve every drop of support and a new kind of recognition. And that's what I want to talk about today. So in these times, as I read all these multiple manifestos and declarations circulating, I do share some of the sentiments I've seen, which is kind of a waste it's a waste of a crisis if we don't go for it. And we are indeed in a determining moment of change, but we need reflection, and we need to gather our forces, we the stubborn and the determined, to propose and push through not ideals, but specific actionable points about the change we want to see in our communities, our world, and in the way business is done. Excuse me. So many voices at the moment are saying, oh, build back better, let's have a better world after the pandemic. And so I did pause and say, is this a further risk for our movement, or is it actually an opening to reboot not just the traditions of fair trade, but to take them much wider into the regeneration to come? So the best practices and meaning of fair trade, I think, expressed so brilliantly in the WFTO's 10 principles, I think actually mirror and reflect and capture so well what's been the most positive of the phenomena of this crisis: social closeness, fair-mindedness, social solidarity, concern, respect, bravery for those who care, who go the extra mile, who volunteer, who are organizing and are striving to keep everybody informed and positive. All of this is happening now everywhere. It's social closeness amidst deep physical fear and distancing. So the question is, what has fair trade got to offer in this situation? So for this lecture, as a real courtesy to my hosts, I actually did think a lot about Scotland. It was a follow-on from a very interesting white paper that some of you might like to see that was published earlier this year and put together last year. But I thought I should just say, what is a fair trade nation first? I'm not sure everybody would know that. But I do recommend you visit the Scottish Fair Trade Forum website, and it shows a lot about their aims for Scotland, an already quite feisty and independent nation, for fair trade. And I think this whole notion of a fair trade nation or a fair trade region, which is also within the concept, which was developed by the International Fair Trade Towns movement, are all online, and they're important because they go beyond the success or failure of individual companies and have something really important to say about all the different parts of a society and its role and the actions that it takes to make something a fair place. And I think that we'd like our world to be a fair place. And even if you're not in Scotland, I'm sure you'd like your region and your world there to be a fair place. So, but I wanted to, first of all, to just zoom in on one thing I found in the criteria for a fair trade nation, which is so relevant right now, which is to acknowledge the role of fair trade in economic development policies. And this is why governments are incredibly important, and why fair trade is important and has things to offer. And I think it's important, you know, for us just to sort of pull out what is the deeper relevance of our fair trade story, our fair trade movement, and our experiences for our economies right now. So the way our movement has grown and evolved and learned and connected is of utmost relevance for inclusive and just economies, just generally. Fair trade businesses and the clusters and the supply chains that we've created and the community and consumer networks that have come together around our efforts provide important gateways to the changes in the direction of business, the value of business, and our business culture post-COVID. And we've got tons of experience, decades of practice and experience that can fill the gaps which are glaring to us, but not glaring to many other proclaimed ethical supply chains. And I think what we do, and that extra mile content of real fair trade and solidarity trade, shows up the flaws in the sustainability and CSR approaches. It shows up their superficiality in many senses. So let me summarize what I mean by this. What has fair trade got to offer? I think it's got 5 things broadly. Knock-on effects, or as we used to say about Nicaragua a very long time ago, the threat of a good example. Deep traceability, trading not just to sell goods, but to change things. And taking the time, knowing that change takes time and cannot be forced. And because there's such a wide range of people and styles and philosophies involved in our movement, other than the nuts and bolts, there's a multifaceted approach to acknowledging, embracing, and being part of solutions to the deprivation and challenges that most workers and most producers face. These are super important things. And then there's the fair price and the social premiums and the extra, which has become synonymous with fair trade, but it is super important, and we'll come to it, but it has never been the only thing, let me put it that way. So let's go into a little bit more detail. So knock-on effects. What am I talking about? So I think my story today is never only going to be about producers. It can't be. But just as in producing communities, the presence of a super well-organized co-op forces middlemen and the intermediaries and the briefcase traders to behave better, to pay more, to show some respect. So in our consuming societies, successful fair traders have also influenced our marketplaces. Successful social enterprises and fair trade change the norms. They prod others through competitive impulse or emotional impulse to do something they weren't doing before. Fair traders make an enormous and important focus on awareness raising, because fair traders call out for not just buying things, but thinking about things, being part of things. And they do this through their stubborn commitment to stand for something, to do something, and to tell everybody about it. And not, of course, the same as brand marketing at all. And by doing these things, both in producing communities and in consuming communities, we have all influenced many companies who don't have anything like these values, don't have anything like these motives. Even when looking back, sometimes it proved to have been superficial or conducted to manage the threat of competition or to manage public perceptions of their brands. I mean, I think for a long time we were happy that people were trying, but it wasn't sticky, my new word of the week. It didn't get locked in, so people could chop and change, and they weren't really changing themselves. 2, deep traceability. Most audited supply chains in the world just cannot really tell you or document who really produces the goods that they buy. Knowing that level of detail is not really a source of pride for most conventional companies. In fact, knowing the detail and all the potential problems and even horrors that you might find there, and not knowing the details is actually a big risk for most conventional companies. But responding to a risk triggers defensiveness, withdrawal, and not engagement. Risks are to be avoided, measured, and managed, and particularly reputational risks. I think fair trade means something quite different. It means the careful selection of partners, really knowing the details, sometimes over many years, investing in that mutual knowledge, bringing people here, going there, trying to understand, trying to live with shocks. Doing more and more business doesn't bring prosperity and improve livelihoods to producers, their families, and communities. More is not better. Yes, those kinds of theories of change are very common, and they're often applied for the justification of many activities and investments and interventions, but they are really just that, without a lot of very deliberate nuts and bolts and fine-tuning and knowledge. They're just theories. I think fair traders often really do have a better idea of what needs to change, what can change. They're better at learning and listening. They know that adaptation is vital. Lack of resources makes for prioritization and focus. And I think knowing the detail, all the dynamics within organizations, the loyalties, the different regions, the politics, is actually really vital and totally underestimated. Watching change happen, ensuring that there are positive impacts of trade over time, requires long-term relationships. And these are really anathema to most conventional businesses. But knowing people involved, building a trusting dialogue, accepting that sometimes you may not be the best arbiter of what's a good strategy, and seeing and listening to other people's perspectives and priorities is mutually beneficial. This is what helps to see where the money really goes and what's working for everybody engaged in the work. I just received, as part of my outreach for this, a very lovely example actually from Sustainable Harvest, who recently took on the very long-standing coffee trading work of twin trading, a casualty of the shift to mainstream fair trade and the change in the marketplace. He wrote, "One thing I'd like to share is how the COVID crisis has brought our supply chain partners closer together. More Zoom conversations, roasters, producers, everyone online, more understanding that we're totally interdependent, and more decisiveness and taking steps, making action happen. When with crisis comes opportunity, and this has been an opportunity to deepen all of our commercial and other relationships. We've been in constant touch, we've learned so much, and it's clear that everybody in our networks was deeply concerned with food security and health safety. We had calls that drove home the message that people didn't have food in remote rural areas, and especially coffee pickers, workers who had no source of income or were trapped because of lockdowns and curfews. You will have heard these stories from other places. We learned that many of our producers were doing all sorts of things, making food deliveries, transporting supplies needed from villages, bringing coffee back in the trucks once it was collected. We asked dozens of our partners what they needed most. In the end, we said, right, we've got $150,000 we've earmarked for training in 2020, and we've sent it directly as aid for activities to be implemented by those farmers themselves. There's no overhead, there's no fuss, there's no doubt. It's just a way to allow organized cooperatives to do what they do best, delivering services and benefits to their members in the communities. Because of the business model, all our fair trade producer leaders and our roasters know each other. They know each other firsthand in many cases. And this is different. This is different from other commercial traders because it's taken us several decades of hosting the partners together, thousands sometimes at our annual gathering. I think this ability to build on co-responsibility and shared responsibility within a supply chain is completely overlooked. That's me, not Sustainable Harvest saying this, in conventional supply chains. There's a lot more, and some of the video conversations are really fun, so I just put the links up there. So I think what we've got here is fair traders generally unafraid of problems, and they're in trade to change things, and they know that it takes time. So all businesses need and see the need for improvements, but I think that the contrast here is so stark, and I do work a great deal in conventional supply chains as a consultant, and I've learned a lot. But conventional, even ethical, putatively ethical supply chains do want to seek improvements in their supply chains, including social and labor changes. The most common approach is to use their purchasing power, the power they have over their suppliers, to exhort change, greater compliance with codes, with standards, or greater reliability, or greater delivery. an ever lowering of production costs. One of the main justifications that I've seen for conventional business interventions in factories and large farms. And behind it all the time is lurking this need to identify and eliminate risks. That means identify the risks, not take them away. Yeah? So by contrast, I think fair traders means knowing that change can be needed, and there may be things that aren't very good going on, but a lot more acceptance that the content, the context and the causalities are critical. Poverty, instability, lack of basic viability, expensive finance, unreliable banking, you know, you name it, all of that is so detrimental to advancing or making improvements in many poor communities. And we all know that conditions can worsen at any time for both local and international reasons, now being a perfect example of that. But within the fair trade relationship, what I've seen over many years now is that sometimes a sort of broad knowledge or even sometimes an impulse to be a partner and to promote products from a certain area or a certain co-op over time becomes much more detailed, much more nuanced, and evolves because it's given time to mature. And out of that comes commitment and engagement to solve problems, not run away from them. Because of, I've already mentioned, the approaches, the problems are many and diverse, and so are the fair traders. But I think the point I wanted to make really here was that conventional businesses find it incredibly hard to offer flexibility at just one level. Frontline staff are just not empowered to do that. They don't have it in their institutional mindset. And so the responsiveness to the specificities of suppliers or the specificities of a country and with a prevailing problem is not there. It's really not there. And there is no one size fits all. You know, you may have a code, you may have a set of rules, but how to apply them in a different context requires a very different way and approach. So that kind of mutuality of wanting change, trying to work with people, achieving continuity of supply in conventional business is rare, and so are the really important tools to make it happen. Predictability, multi-year contracts, business-related investments, taking ownership of the problems that you identify and you'd like your suppliers not to have. And interventions and projects are often just so short-term and they're non-adaptive. They're written on paper and they have to be done that way even when everyone knows they will fail. How sad is that? So I think research on lots of corporations that I've been doing recently shows how incredibly hard conventional businesses find it to connect and to find and to work with people on the ground who are the most relevant representative bodies, unions, civil society, refugee committees, you name it. This is a very big problem for conventional business. So they remain largely unaware of how people really feel and how they know they could best help themselves, which would be in their interest. But many fair traders, whilst providing a range of underpinning support, pre-trade finance, access to loans, training on quality, payment of premiums, all sorts of important, very important things, frequently also work to join the dots, help provide expertise that they themselves do not have, linking partner enterprises, knowing that a successful co-op may need 50 partners, not one. And I think most recently, but I was thinking of East Timor as another example, rising to the occasion when your partners are in times of disaster. And this has been another of those times that we're living now. Finally, fair pricing. I think for everybody, including fair traders, the exciting ranges of social enterprises, B2Bs, B Corps, social entrepreneurs operating in our interconnected landscapes, we do try to do the fair price proposition. There are lots of formula, there are methods that try and capture all aspects of costs and even to factor in needs and specificities that I was just talking about. And some of that has become institutionalized through social premium for producer support funds or other kinds of mechanisms that share profit, or awards, investment awards. I mean, we do have a multitude of ways of adding to the package of fair trade. Ultimately, however, every producer and fair trader faces what I've called what the market will take moments. And from this, there are consequences. Something gets done for free if you don't pay for it when you buy something. And the production of that item or the provision of that service is effectively subsidized to the user or internalized by somebody. It doesn't get magicked away because it can't be paid. And of course, that's usually the weakest person, the most desperate, or the person with the least bargaining power. And if we do not respect fair pricing, and if we continue on our Dutch auction modeling, then a lot doesn't get done. People don't have incomes that they can live on. You don't get the full PPE that you needed, or the essential safety improvements, or the leak in the roof. There are so many things that are not done when we don't observe a fair deal in all that we do. So consumers are key in this. Consumers who support the idea that choice makes not just a difference, but it makes these kinds of difference. It is with great regret that we have lost our voice, and we've somehow lost that argument amidst the plethora of propositions, I would say. But anyway, as our economies are kind of in shrink mode everywhere, we do really need to find a way to ensure that every penny that is spent, and we'll all have less money, but every penny that is spent well, and every purchase helps to leverage some kind of fundamental change or some provision of something that is basically needed in all of our economies, and reducing that deprivation gap, deprivation difference, sometimes called inequality. And I think that's why the last few minutes of my presentation, I went into quite a different mode. I went into the mode of policy prescription. And I was excited by the idea that Scotland is a fair trade nation and you have an independent government that presumably and hopefully cares for all people who live in Scotland and all of your linked communities around the world. So here we are, COVID-19. Governments are already starting to throw money at businesses. They've started to support business. So what do we have to say about this? Well, there's an opportunity to shape that, to ensure the survival of fair trade and social enterprises, and to leverage significant behavior and system changes in other companies to get that wider impact within our local economies and our global economies. So we do need, I think, a new vision and a stomach for some tough conditionalities. For those of you who do know me, you'll know I worked in the World Bank for 6 years, and they were very hot on conditionalities, although they were rather unpopular. But they've been part and parcel of international assistance by states, multilateral organizations, and perhaps less recognized, also a lot of aid agencies for a very, very long time. And a lot is written about how bad they are. But I decided to resurrect them and to make the case that we should use them to protect ourselves and what we value in all economies, and our economies and the Scottish economy. So I wanted to do two things, and then I'll stop and we can start discussing. So I wanted to set out some key tenets for new economic conditionalities for post-COVID support to companies, right? So you shouldn't give money to companies unless, that's how it goes. So 1, governments should prioritize all enterprises that provide added value or deliver benefits in terms of social care, resilience, progress, and connectivity. And it doesn't matter if those businesses are in Scotland or in the world and connected to Scotland. It is time for governments to demonstrate strong support for firms where every transaction or service or purchase will make a really lasting difference to the situation of the people involved here, there, Scotland, could be anywhere. And then somewhere else, far away, down that invisible supply chain, or not so invisible supply chain if you're fair trade. 2, I think I saw this very nice phrase in a Dutch declaration the other day, disaster capitalists. So you should avoid disaster capitalists with questionable social and employment practices at home and abroad, and absolutely no visible intention of changing. So why pay for that, is my question. So no finance, no grants, no loans for carbon emitting companies without smart carbon reduction in place, or at least a plan in place and being rolled out. I think it's important that we set a high bar by promoting clear, very specific conditionalities and benchmarks. We can argue for those. We can define them. It's not that kind of manifesto-itis that I'm beginning to feel. So I also think it's time to reward and secure the continuity of business for all the early adopters in our movement, all the people who've been pioneering best practices against the odds for a very, very long time. This brings me to benchmarks, not a favorite word for many, but there we go. So how do we set the bar in the right place? Well, focus and benchmarks is the answer. But what is the focus? So I think we have to absolutely require transparency in supply chains. It's great to publish where you buy from. There's a sort of a new thing that you can publish which factories you buy from, and it's sort of a slow but rewarding process, or at least companies being rewarded for their efforts. But I was rather shocked the other day to see that, for example, the Fair Labour Association have a fashion transparency index, and out of the top 250 largest brands, only 7% are able to say where any of their raw materials come from. And only 40% know anything down below the first, what's called tier 1 factory point. So transparency has to really mean it, and it has to be required. And this has an environmental dimension as well as a fair trade dimension. Because if you look at some of the CO2 reduction strategies of companies, which I have been recently, as I am connected to Sainsbury's, it's a really interesting dilemma, because tier one, the ones that are the closest to you, are pretty much under control. And then out there you have the rest, those invisible places, you know, beyond the first point of entry into the supply chain. Two, we have to do something about working to live, living to work. So I think we have to start looking at the fair pricing in a broader context. There has to be transitioning towards decent work and living wages for all as a process. It's not going to happen by diktat, that's for certain. And one of the reasons we're in this mess is that we have such a weak influence over corporations. The governance of corporations doesn't need to listen. And there are lots of tussles about whose voice matters most. And traditionally it's shareholders, although there have been some quite successful efforts to weaken that in some jurisdictions. But I think we have to say, what do we want to focus on? We want to focus on more participatory ownership and better governance of companies to help bring about a lot of these policy changes. And actually, being a responsible company shouldn't be discretionary. It should be part of what you do, and it should come out of your cost of goods, since you're all fair traders, you'll know what I mean, and not out of your a fraction of a bit of a proceed of your profit. Structured, not discretionary support to achieve good things, to solve problems. I think those are the areas that we should really, really focus on. And I was very happy when I had been writing and having a look back at conditionalities to see this incredible piece in The Guardian the other day, reminding us that when we all bailed out the banks in 2008, a figure, by the way, that dwarfs what's been spent so far on COVID, it's warning us and saying we shouldn't do this again. We should not respond to this crisis with an unconditional bailout that swelled public debt while demanding nothing in return. This is our popular right in all our countries. Finally, final. So I think this is not a plea. I think we can illustrate and we can demonstrate with examples from our stubborn, brave and widespread creative fair trade enterprise and movement. There are tons of model company resolutions and policies all over the place. There are empowering governance mechanisms, everything from the largest public pension in California to my lovely little fair trade group down the road. Governance is possible. It's a question of choice. So I think we should be looking for resolutions that can be given to companies that they don't pay dividend payments in return when they've received state aid, that they have to use the money they've got to build representation, consultation, milestones, shared value propositions, and build into their business going forward something that feeds and nurtures social change over time. Producer and worker support funding that is not discretionary on some department that has nothing to do with the core business. And because this would be public money, we need reporting back requirements and methods. So many brilliant ways to do this. Conclusions. Fair trade is no longer about consumers who care and producers who are far away. It's about all of us. And it's about any solution finding business, because we need them everywhere and we don't just need them in coffee. And I think companies that have that solution finding mission, learning mission, are really the market leaders and should be treated as such. And then as consumers and workers, as voters, you know, empathy, social purpose within business should be our requirement of our governments, because governments set norms and they reward businesses. Tax, remember? And all our post-COVID relief packages that are going to be floating among our across our screens in the coming months. So that's my conclusion, and I'm going to stop, and we're going to have a discussion, and we will be posting this on the website, probably not for a few days, but we will. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Pauline. That was absolutely fantastic. I think you all agree it was very inspiring, but very informative and practical as well, just in terms of what fair trade can offer, but also some good hard policy recommendations towards the end. So thank you. And I think yeah, I think we'll all agree that I suppose being called stubborn is the biggest compliment you could give us fair traders. So thank you. I all agree with you and Erinch there. Thank you for that. Okay, so just looking at the comments here, sorry, the Q&A. So, Pauline, if you want to open that as well, we can just run through them. But I've just been keeping an eye on them. And I think we'll start at the top. So, first of all, Rosie has picked up on the word that you used, sticky, which is a fantastic use of the word in terms of referring to organisations' commitments and the fact that they don't continue to commit later on. So, could you expand on that a bit more, or point to any further reading? Is there anything else you can say on that for us?
Sorry, which one first?
Just the first one, just the idea of change to be sticky, yes.
So I think, so sticky for me means something that is so obvious and continues to be obvious that it doesn't go away, right?
Okay.
So, and you know, one of the things that happened, you know, you mentioned Cafe Direct, but you know, when we started Cafe Direct and I came back from a disaster in the coffee world, which was really, really, really crashed prices, I remember this moment and I thought, well, I don't want to plead for help. You know, I don't want to appeal. So I think the other merit of fair trade is that we shouldn't appeal for anything. We should work for it and make it happen. And I've learned so much about government policy in recent years and corporate behaviour that I think we should demand it. And we have rights as individual citizens wherever we are. And I know you're all over the world, you guys. So, you know, we have rights as citizens, we have rights as consumers. We're all working. We also have rights as workers. And we should rethink how we get these things. And the stickiness means you take advantage of all the sort of law and apparatus of government and international society that works. But in the end, you have to have a really super idea for it to stick. It has to really, really be worth having. Yeah?
Sure, thank you. And I think that maybe leads us into a question actually from Sally. So you sort of addressed some of the unease maybe in the fair trade movement, or suggested that fair trade has lost its voice. Because fair trade is a good idea and we all know that. Do you have any thoughts on how we find it and how we can start using it again in such a noisy world?
So I mean, again, if you'd asked me, you know, on February the 2nd, I would have answered this differently. Yeah. But it's a great question because it's quite complicated, isn't it? And but I do think there's two types of voice. So there's the voice of our social and economic movement against others who are trying to destroy us and take away our messages, or just bloody better than us, right? Have more money to spend, don't mind lying, you know, all that stuff. So we've got the unfair and the fair competitors, and we didn't make the most of what we had when we were stronger, and now we're weak, right? So we've got the marketplace, but I see actually this pandemic is already creating a step change, I think, in how people will view companies. It's like, you know, for those of you who are not European, this won't make any sense. But, you know, there used to be this question, it's like, what did you do in the war? And they were talking about World War II. But here it's like, how did you behave in the pandemic? And companies that were trying to cancel all their contracts in Bangladesh because of force majeure, which is bad things happening in your contract, got incredible backlash. So we have, again, what did we do in the pandemic, right? We've got a new cutting edge, because even if I am absolutely certain, not just the example I gave, but I gave it because I know so many people are working so hard not to make this more than the disaster it is, right? So that's one part of it. I think the other part of it is we need to abandon a lot of our fixations, right? We need to call a day to quite a lot of our small-mindedness, right? Our fixation with labels, right? Versus meaning. And I really think we have to work together. We absolutely do not have to merge, but we do have to collaborate. And I think this Zoom mechanism today, where I saw the list, people are all over the world, and I'm so happy about that. so obviously that question, just, you know, you could have a whole Zoom on that one.
Sure.
Today. Brilliant question.
Brilliant. Okay, so actually that leads into Eve from Fair Trade Scotland Limited has asked two questions sort of relating to WFTO, and actually just what you mentioned there about the international fair trade movement. So the first one is the role of the fair trade product label. So how important do you think that product label is in making the producer visible in the supply chain? I don't know if you can see that question. And then further down as well, she's also talked about, so do you think it's time for a UK constituted fair trade national platform speaking with one voice on fair trade, using the International Fair Trade Charter as the underpinning document? So do you think that's needed in the UK?
So let me take these two. I'm not the fount of all knowledge here, but my gut feeling is there are too many labels, and even if ours is good or theirs is better, we've kind of passed our sell by date, and the sheer cost of delivering that label, right? And in some cases, the lack of effectiveness in the controls around those labels, even our labels, right? You know, it's no better than audit. And I'm a big critic of audit, because audit finds nothing that people want to hide, right? And I'm afraid some of those labels are the same, right? So I'm less concerned about the labels. I would love to find a way for us to demonstrate the meaning of our work, yeah? And I'm a rather big fan of the WFTO's self-assessment model, because it motivates people to improve, right? And it isn't so expensive. Headline. National, international, yeah, we've got to cooperate. I don't know what the platform should be. I haven't really thought that clearly about it, but somebody will have thought about it, so you could have a Zoom on that. But yeah, I think we can't find one voice, because we're all really different, but we could find a voice that we, you know, a shared voice, and we need to have numbers. We really, really need to have numbers. We need to become a mass movement. And I'm not just saying that because I'm some old 60s lefty, right? Although that's true. But, you know, we need those platforms. I can't comment, so I can't sit here and say, yeah, we should have a national platform. My instinct is international, but there we go.
Thank you very much. So I noticed, so if we take the next question in the chat box from Meg, who teaches international development in the US, and we've got a question further down from Naima, who's also a member of our Young People's Network. So I suppose this is in relation to some of those things we're talking about in terms of how we communicate the fair trade message to the new generation. or remind people of it, or rebrand. Sometimes we talk about, is there a need for fair trade to be rebranded, or is it about reminding people? So Meg is asking, so yeah, what are the one or two most important things to teach or inspire graduate students? And she would like to know specifically from you, who's cared and worked and impacted the world. And then Naima is talking, her question is specifically in relation to how do we bring more young people on board to the fair trade movement. And yeah, I suppose, and those in the rising environmental movement.
So thank you, Meg. Meg is an inspired and an innovative teacher who has written some incredible books about pro-poor IP and all sorts of amazing things that are relevant to our movement. I think, you know, I was invited to my son's school to talk to the sixth form last term. That was when they were all still at school, and they do a lot of careers and, you know, finding your career and all those sorts of things. And I gave the keynote, and the keynote was selecting an ethical career, right? And I talked through all the different ways that you, as a person going out in the world to work, should learn to understand the real nature of the companies that you went to work for. And if you were not a combative person wanting to go in there and change them and potentially get burned, what kinds of companies you should opt for. And if you were, go in there with an analysis of the gaps. I said, either way, you'll get the job in the interview, because we were doing interview practices. So I do think, you know, I think young people, you know, every generation has a name now, you know, XYZ, you know, bananas. But I think people under a certain age group haven't had to learn, and have learned in a different way about what's important and what's valuable. And the best thing I could say is take it with you. You know, what's that? Be the change you want to see in the world. You know, so what makes a company ethical? You know, what skills, how to use skills, whether you're an accountant or something else. You know, I think it's important to create a different, out of the box thinking cadre of new people going into business.
Yeah, so education is incredibly important. Yep. Thank you. So let's have a look. So, oh yes, so we've got a question from Christine on the conditionalities that you'd mentioned. So can we have a conditionality that all companies should report on their fair trade purchasing?
So the reason I was so happy to do the Fair Trade Nation lecture was because I could imagine myself having a conversation with Nicola Sturgeon, right? You know. So the question is, could we have? Yeah, we could have whatever we want. The thing I was trying to find was things where there are ways for us to insist on it, right? So, you know, if it seems unlikely that a government could insist on that, and I don't know whether demanding it as a public movement, a social movement, would make much difference. Sorry, Christine.
Christine, does that help at all? I don't know if you want to come in there.
Yeah, do you want to? Yeah, you're allowed.
Yeah, we can bring people in. So if Christine's still there.
Hey there.
I don't hear from her.
Okay.
Okay, maybe we can come back to that. Thank you for your comment and question, Christine. Okay, so so Liz is, yes, I suppose this is in relation again to the role of the kind of regulatory and governance and fair trade. So what do you think are the greatest levers that we have to change public sector policies and behaviours about changing fairly traded goods in the new normal?
So protest and survive, as they used to say. I think in the context of the nation, but even in the context of local government, you know, we are voices as individuals. I mean, I think Scotland, your network of fair trade is so diverse I can't imagine you couldn't get up a sort of a message and it would be heard, because you have a representativeness across church, of business, of, you know, social movement, you know, of schools, universities. I mean, it's really, really a fantastic piece of mobilization and collectivity. So collectivity, the greatest lever. But I do think we're going to have to shout incredibly loud, and not, if not as one, at least united across a number of things. So I was looking at some Avaz, you know, they have a phenomenal 61 million members, and I was looking at their petition and their statement to EU leaders and what have you, mostly focused on this Green New Deal idea of coming out of this less carbon heavy and so on. But I think voices, we're back to voice, aren't we? But I think messaging that is irresistible and sticky, you know, for politicians, campaigning, and we've always been quite good at that. We've been part of movements that were good at campaigning. But, you know, I think it needs to be more there needs to be more collectivity. So I don't think, I'm sorry, Rachel, I saw you on the list, but I don't think like Oxfam saying we should do this is enough. You know, Oxfam doesn't speak for me, but if it had a way to be more collective and representative, or joined in with something that effectively was, I think that is the way politics is beginning to be done. It's less traditional, it's more amorphous, but in the end, it's quite powerful. And social media, the other lever. Social media.
Of course, yeah.
The old person who doesn't much use social media.
Everyone's that nowadays. Yeah, and I suppose in Scotland with the Fair Trade Nation campaign, which grew out of the Fair Trade Towns movements and churches and fair trade groups across the country, you know, it is that idea of we're accountable to being a fair trade nation. So I suppose, yeah, I suppose that's had some relative success in being sticky. You know, it's still here after all those years, and you know, we have to be accountable to it, and we have to maintain that status. So Matthew's actually just wondering though, do you think though we have to re-politicise those campaigns in terms of, so they're not just about bringing people together, but actually maybe have a more coordinated message? I think I hear you saying that. Would that be right?
Yes, so let's hit the nail on the head. For too many years, the bodies that ran the certification part of fair trade didn't really strategically view what they were doing, right? And needed to sort of just like keep people who were irritated over there somewhere, right? So I think it's time they admitted they made some really, really big mistakes, right? And we're done over for them, yeah? You know, you let Nestle in and then you let Nestle out, right? And so, you know, I think we do need to be more political, and there's an awful lot at stake at this point. So it's probably a one in a generational sort of moment to have a jolly good old whack. And yes, you'll make some people unhappy, and you may lose some of your supporters who are a little bit more kind of nice and less politicized. But I'm sorry, but I think we have to get to the point like hard and quite fast.
Of course, yeah, some of the more needed. So
before they give all the money to people who are going to put you all out of business.
Of course, and yeah, and I was thinking about the environment as well, thinking that we really are in a climate emergency. You know, there's
yes,
no time like yeah, now is the time to do it really. Okay, so Christine, I think is back, and I think she was just having a snack. So Christine, do you want to come in actually just to expand on your point on conditionalities? If you're still there, if you can, I think you should be able to unmute yourself. And if not, we can try and find you and unmute you. No, we don't.
So Colleen omitted to mention at the beginning because she thought it would encourage you all too much, but there's a little hand waving thing if you really want to speak.
Yes. Oh, there we go. Yes, perfect. Perfect. Oh, do you know what? Yes, we should be using that actually, because then I can allow you to talk. That's the way to do it. Thank you, Pauline. Okay, Christine. So I can Yes.
Now I can speak.
Yes.
Wonderful.
Sorry about that.
Thanks, Pauline. Wonderful, 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 inspiring talk. No, I think I just thought that if we could, like the Modern Slavery Act, you know, if people get behind a something that's tangible and definable, and that's what's so good about, because there is now the Charter of Fair Trade, there is a commonality between people understanding what fair trade is. If we could get behind campaigning saying this is something that we expect all companies to do, bit like the Modern Slavery Act, very similar sort of reporting activity, then it would start that dialogue around all the other things like engagement with vulnerable communities, transparency, delivery on orders, on procurement practices. So it could be a mechanism for that transparent change that's required. So I don't know, I just think it could be, I think we have enough collaboration across the fair trade movement, not probably enough, but starts of it to make that possible. But if you think it's totally unrealistic, then okay, I'll think about the next idea.
Oh, Pauline, you're still muted.
Because I was a little uncertain, it sounded a bit like wishful thinking, but now you've firmed it up a bit for me. So I actually think the Modern Slavery Act was an amazing thing in the UK. Of course, there are other versions of this in other parts of the world which are better and worse in some cases. But given that we're, you know, sitting in the UK, it is an interesting thing, but it had its limitations also. So for those of you not aware of it, it requires companies over a certain time, a certain size, to report annually on their supply chains. But it didn't say what you had to report on. So you can still send in, and there are really nice sort of organizations like Aegon and all the rest of it who kind of occasionally look at all these things and say, that doesn't say much, right? And so there's the watching the reporting going on now, because they're obliged to report, but it didn't say what. But I do think, so here we go. I think that's a great idea, and I'd be happy to help work on that too. However, here's the controversial bit. If we call that fair trade, we'll get overclouded by the models of fair trade that we now know and don't love, right? And so I hate to say this, but I feel we would have to come up with some other name for it. So I just put it there. And I'm a big fair trade supporter, so it's not because I don't want it to be fair trade. But I think we've done damage with the word. And somebody who's not on the call, when I first said I was going to kickstart this new thing to reclaim fair trade, it says, you can't call it fair trade, it's a bad thing. And I'm going, well, why should somebody else ruin it and then not let, you know, I'm going to at least try and say, well, fair is good. You know, there's no better that's not fair, right? And sustainability, if it's not fair, is not sustainability, right? You know, it's just like, once you've got that principle in your head, you can't get away from it. However, so I think it's a really good idea. And I think we could quite well, if we couch this as the fair trade is no longer us here and them there, and it's about linkages between enterprises and people working all over the world that do it good, right? I think that would be, we might need to find a way, because I think fair trade, having just made the case for the opposite, I think fair trade is a problematic word for now. Thank you, Christine.
Thank you very much, Christine. Okay, so the next question actually is quite a long one from Jonathan, but so Jonathan, now that we can use this attendee function, the raise the hand function, I don't know if you want to come in and bring your question in. Yes, thank you, Jonathan. Okay, allowed to talk, go for it.
Thank you very much. My question basically is, I've worked with Pauline in different ways over those 30 years. My question is, in many ways, we had more success than we ever imagined. And in a way, I think we failed to really change capitalism and have been nearly fully integrated. And so you have recommendations about focusing on different things, getting better at messaging, communication, demanding certain things. But fundamentally, do you see a way that fair trade can play a role in creating a post-capitalist economy or helping dramatically shift, perhaps over generations, our economic reality?
Oh, Pauline, you're still muted as well.
Yes, Jonathan. I agree. Yes, Jonathan and I have had this conversation for 30 years. No, actually, I'm more on Jonathan's side, but in my life, I've become interested in making things happen as well, right? So I've always thought the only way to beat horrible people who run profit-driven, heartless companies is to shame them out of existence or fine the hell out of them, or beat them at their own game so that in their ecosystem they can't afford to carry on the way they are. Yeah, that's it. A lot of my origins in fair trade, came from a very left-wing perspective, and it took me years and very patient Michael Barrett Brown to convince me we weren't actually going to be able to overthrow capitalism per se. And I was quite disappointed at the time. So I think that the question here, though, is the sensible one is we were successful, but we also have seriously failed as a social and economic movement, because even though we have this proliferation of so-called green and anthroposophical and ethical banks, they haven't grown with us. They're not with us, right? So I'm not proposing we set up a bank, but I'm just saying I am deeply disappointed in the performance of us as a social movement that had different objectives, and I can't go back and say let's look at Mondragon and build the whole thing, because that isn't possible in a global, interconnected global world per se. So I don't think we've really thought through how to make a go of a really good people serving, environment serving economic reality. We haven't worked that out institutionally, and we always fall back and rely on those who don't want that vision either. Yeah. So I have a deep distrust of ethical banks, I have to say, at the moment.
So in a way, you're saying we don't have a clear vision of success, what success looks like, and therefore our strategy is just kind of an idealistic make a better world without a clear strategy to create a different economy.
So no, I agree. But if those people who will have known Robert Murray, and if you don't, please go read about him on our website and nice things he wrote. But he wrote a paper once when we were setting up Cafe Direct called The Alternative Multinational. And so for lots of people, a multinational is sort of basically a slightly tainted word, but we haven't managed to put up anything. We are a multinational. If we were all really connected and working together in the nice way that we sometimes do when we're doing okay, we are a multinational, but we haven't institutionalized that and made it robust enough to really fight off the rest. And this is probably the only way we can win out with different systems. And just as I'm on the board of the Transnational Institute, and I've been a fellow of that institute for a very long time, and that whole period that I've been connected to it in some way, the role of the state, the public ownership of utilities versus privatization of utilities, all those things, those debates have just gone. But what's really interesting in the new work on the role of the state, public ownership and public policy, is what they call municipalization. In other words, because of technology and because of the way things are working, and definitely now in this pandemic, the atomization of everybody, we're all in our houses, but we have Zoom and other things. The level at which we can aggregate is completely different from when Robin was writing. So I think we have to set up robust structures, fight for them, and we have to get public acknowledgement of fair trade in economic development policies, which is why I really, really read those criteria and thought, that's an important one, really, really important. So Jonathan, I can't answer you. You know that. I've never.
Of course. But I think what I've come to see, Pauline, part of what I'm curious about for fair trade is that in the solidarity economy movement that I worked in for several years, seeing if that had more hope than fair trade, they have a really clear vision of building an alternative economy that I think fair trade is missing, but they don't really have a realistic strategy to actually get there. And I've come to conclude that fair trade had some really great strategies, but without that vision, and I think without actually tackling colonialism and white supremacy, fair trade is sort of has floundered because it doesn't have a real vision of success, which would create some real tension with capital. And so instead, I think we've just allowed ourselves to be integrated here and there.
So the closest I've felt to seeing the power of people to make companies back down, other than regulation, right, was working with an NGO called Light Years IP when I lived in the States. And Meg, who's on the line, will know all about this because we had collaborated also. And the Starbucks tried to take the trademark certain types of Ethiopian coffee, and had they been able to do that, they would have lost it forever, because it's a sort of first come first served system. And it was so obviously wrong. They hadn't done anything. They just bought it and knew how to fill up a trademark application form. Whereas I suspect most of the, hurrah coffee farmers didn't even know what a trademark could be or the importance of it until we got there and talked about it a lot. And so I think it's very interesting, because out of that came, I think, one day in our campaign, the CEO of Starbucks got 1,000 faxes in his personal fax machine number, which we managed to get from somebody. And, of course, the fight went on, because they pushed it into the National Coffee Association, which is all the really, really big ones, not just Starbucks. So the fight went on for many years and became a legal fight too. But actually that pressure of this sticky, obvious, you're wrong kind of message was cool. And I think we need to find that. We need to find that. Yeah, we need to find that. And that's complicated because there are so many layers. But somehow we need to find it, and we need to mobilize people and come together. Yeah. We, the royal we.
Sorry. Oh, okay, thank you, Jonathan and Pauline, for that interesting discussion. So I'm actually just quite conscious of time, so we've only got 5 minutes left, but I do want to just take so there's 3 questions here that were here for the last sort of 15 minutes or so. So from Sally, so how confident are you that governments will listen and not just rush back to the comfort of business as usual? So Ellie's is a comment, so I'll leave that just now. And then Roberta, so she's another comment in relation to the role of fair trade nations and towns, but within that comment also, do you think that fair trade social movement and consumer communities could represent a 6th element in terms of future economic transformations? So that's a nice, interesting idea. So Combs is more of a question. And then finally, the one from Sean is about the living wage and the living income. I'm not sure if Sean's meaning in terms of in the UK and perhaps in a European context or Western context, or beyond that. But yeah, I suppose how that intersects with the fair trade movement. So Pauline, if I could ask you, and I do know there's other questions there, but I think we'll leave them just now. But if you could comment on them, or
yeah, I'll have a go quickly.
Yeah, that'd be fantastic.
So actually there's one just there, Ellie, who's my colleague. Hello, Ellie. So she said she'd sent me, but I didn't see it in time, I'm sorry. But a note posted on a closed travel agent's window in the high street saying, closed for good. Right, so pretty cool. I think, you know, the transformation part, we shouldn't over promise or over hope for a voluntary social movement, and we will need good arguments. So the sixth element, I think we shouldn't be the sixth. We think we should be the first. Because everybody has a moment now where they can reflect on when your company doesn't pay you well, what it does, when it doesn't pay tax enough, or the government doesn't spend enough on your health service. I think people are having this moment of clarity. So I think our best possibility is clarity of our moment, the moment that we're living in. But it's a good question. And labels, we'll have to do it another time. Sean, thank you for coming. I have to be careful. No, I think it's a fantastic intersect. I mean, you know, if we buy the argument that we have those of us who wish to push, Sean is from Verite, which stands for Fair Labour Worldwide, and I do a lot of work with Sean and his colleagues at Verite. If we want to push, and we want companies to take some of these things very seriously, if they don't hear it from their shareholders, shareholder activism side, if they don't hear it from their shareholders, they have to hear it from somebody else, government or customers, right? So shareholders come first, normally, traditionally. Government, because they can't be seen to not comply with the law, but they have enormous power to influence the law. And I think this overlap is really important, because we know that the whole business of fair pricing and fair terms of trade, which is what the trading thing is about, it's the package, it's not just the price. You know, if we think of the problems that come about that make work unfair, conditions poor or terrible, it's the terms of trade and the conditions that are offered by companies, including the price, you know, the time you've got to make it, things like that, the clauses for refusing and for fining and all those sorts of things. I think that so many companies are paying lip service to the living wage and living income inclusion. We should just say that living wages have been in lots of ethical codes for quite some time, but not acted upon. I think we should work together, because unless you have a movement for fair price that incorporates World Bank speak externalities, including the environment and waste management and waste reduction and CO2 reduction, then you don't have a fair and a sustainable economy. So I think we might have the wind in our sails there if we could make the argument fit.
Thank you, Pauline.
So I got
that's very. So I realise actually we're just out of time, but I don't know. Yes, I think maybe actually just to finish up. So sorry, Barbara and Eve, we didn't get to your questions, but yeah, I suppose thank you very much, Pauline, for a really inspiring, but I think also challenging lecture, and it's really made us thought and think in terms of what we're doing as a social movement. So thank you very much for that. And I would encourage you, if you don't follow us on Twitter, please do. So we're at Fairtrade Nation, that's the Scottish Fair Trade Forum, but the Journal of Fair Trade is also on Twitter at Journal Fair, and they've got a fantastic introductory publication to the journal that's free to download on their website, so go and check that out. And it's written by Pauline, which is lots of more thought-provoking questions and that in terms of the place of fair trade and today and the future, and today in the future world as well. So so thank you very much. And Pauline, I think I'd just like to give you the last word actually. I don't know if there's anything you want to say before we wrap up and say goodbye to everyone. I don't know if there's some closing words.
So I want to say thank you to the Scottish Fair Trade Forum for inviting me. It really has been a privilege, and I was genuinely surprised, and I've enjoyed it. And secondly, thank you to all of you who signed up. And lots of people wrote to me and said, I can't make it, I want to see it, I want to read it, and we'll do it. And Pauline and I will work together to make sure whatever is there. I think we just started. We should do it again.
Fantastic. Actually, Pauline, yeah, no, fantastic. Yes, let's keep working together in terms of cooperation and all those values that you mentioned in your talk. So yeah, so thank you very much, everyone. So I'm going to end that there. So let's just see, yeah. And yes, we'll save this comments box as well. So we'll capture all your comments and we'll send you the recording as well. So okay. Thank you. It feels all a bit final just to finish it, but yep, stay safe and everyone, and have a good day.
Thank you. Bye. Be safe.